Hey everybody, it is good to be with you again. We're going to continue in a way, kind of looking at some of the prophets. You'll see why that's in a way in a second. We're going to begin a new series this evening for the month of December on Wednesday nights. We're going to talk about the King of Kingdoms, looking through the book of Daniel at some of the things that Daniel is telling us, some of the things we can see in the text itself that will help us get ready for the new year when we begin looking at I don't want to call it the book of books, right? But the book of pictures, we can call it that. It's a picture book. Revelation. When we start looking through Revelation, we're going to look at the things that we can learn from Daniel, from the 12, from the other prophets. And so that's where we're beginning. And we're going to focus on Daniel in its own right and just use it as a primer later to help us understand the book of Revelation. So we're looking at what we're going to call the King of Kingdoms, the God of the universe, the God of creation, who shows himself to be sovereign Lord over all in a series of events, miracles, visions, deliverances, tests, all throughout this book. And Daniel ultimately will leave us at the end with this God whose kingdom is coming, and it will reign forever and ever. And so we're going to see again another one of the prophets looking forward to this coming kingdom, the time when the Messiah will reign, and ultimately all things at the end of time will be gathered together to be with the Lord. So let's kind of start breaking into the book and look at some of the historical events or some of the things that are surrounding what's happening in Daniel's life. Indeed, the life of all the captives as they're being carried off slowly into Babylon, ultimately in 586 with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So what's happening right now is a time of political upheaval. There is a chaos in the Middle East after the fall of the Assyrian Empire. So Babylon is going to rise up. One of the kings of Assyria will die. They'll begin a gradual decline, a pretty fast decline. And Nabopolassar, the grandfather or the father of Nebuchadnezzar, will begin what we call the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And he will go and start causing chaos in the region. The Assyrians are going to have to go fight with him. And there's just uprisings all over the place. One of the good kings we've talked about a few times in the past 12 lessons that we've done over the 12. One of the good kings, Josiah, is going to get involved in a battle trying to stop the king of Egypt from going to help rescue the Assyrians, and he will die. Shortly after that, Egypt, the king of Egypt, Pharaoh Necho, is going to come and is going to kind of put a puppet king in place. Babylon is going to come just a few years later. That happens in 609 BC. Just a few years later, in 605, Babylon is going to come and is going to sack, not ultimately, but kind of attack Jerusalem and be bought off and take some people away captive. And so in 605 BC, that's where we find Daniel being carried off from his home. And he would be young, around 15 years old, most people guess, carried off into a foreign country, brought into a completely different culture, a completely different way of living, and he's going to have to choose who he wants to be. And so we think he's 15 to 20 years old or so. A lot of that is guesswork. We're never actually told, but we're trying to guess how old he would likely be with the various events that are going on throughout the book of Daniel, and based off the dates that we know from secular history. So if he's carried off in 605, we know that he's still alive around the time that the people are coming back from the deportation. And so that would be around 536, 537, 536 BC. And so you've got a pretty long span of time there where Daniel is going to be an older man by the time this starts happening. And so when you look at all of the events of the book, if they start in about 605 and they end up around 530 or so, if he's 15 years old when he's carried off, you're going to wind up with a man who could be in his mid to late 80s by the end of the book. And so that's why we're guessing probably 15, 20 years old at the oldest in 605 BC when Jerusalem is, I guess, attacked and Nebuchadnezzar begins carrying people off. So you have in Daniel's lifetime, before he gets carried off, there are just a series of kings. So while he is living in Judah and while he is in Babylon, he will be alive through 5 different Judean kings. And it's not like they just happen to coincide where there was tragedy or just the way the reigns fell. It's political upheaval. People are being deposed and moved and shuffled and carried off, and it's just chaos. Not only is there this political chaos, but in the midst of all this, you have one of the most active times of prophecy. So you have the prophet Jeremiah, who will be prophesying during this time. There's a good chance that Daniel maybe even got to hear Jeremiah prophesy in Jerusalem, in the surrounding region. Not only that, during Daniel's lifetime, he's also going to be contemporary or contemporaneous with Ezekiel. In fact, Ezekiel will reference Daniel, and so it's very likely that they knew each other. Maybe they knew each other from back home, or maybe Ezekiel just heard of Daniel. Maybe they even met each other in passing, or I don't know if they had a relationship or not in Babylon itself. We just don't know. I like to pretend that they would be good chums. And so there's a lot of activity. That you also have the prophet Habakkuk, who is prophesying at this time. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot in the religious realm. There's a lot in the political realm. There's a lot in the emotional realm, the personal realm for Daniel. And so it's just this time of chaos is a good word, of just cataclysmic change, where nations are being swept off the map, armies are being destroyed, people are being raised up and torn down. And that's just going to be the story of Daniel's life. As he is thrown into the political arena, he's going to be dealing with the machinations of a huge empire that will span the region of the Middle East, one of the largest empires in world history, certainly one of the most powerful empires in world history. He's going to be dealing with the risings and fallings of many kings and kingdoms in that context. He'll be dealing with the rise and fall of kings within the Babylonian Empire. Then they'll be invaded, and there'll be different kings and different people you have to deal with, and the new empire that comes and takes them over. And so it's just change, constant chaos and change. And when Daniel is trying to find something to hang on to, he looks to the rock. He looks to the one who doesn't change. To Jehovah or Yahweh or the Lord. He looks to God. And so when we see Daniel in the middle of all these, just very significant historical events, he is a young man, probably again 15 or 20 years old, a young man with the faith to look to God and realize that his identity is not in being Judean. His identity is not being from Jerusalem. His identity is not in any position or title or king that he serves. His position is in God and God alone, or his identity is in God and God alone. And that allows him in the middle of all that chaos to have calm. And maybe one of the lessons for us, just kind of looking at the circumstances for Daniel's life, it really hasn't changed much, has it? There's always power struggles. There's always some horrible event that happens. There's always grand events that happens. There's just constant change. And there's one thing that is consistent, is that things change. And in those changes, interestingly enough, things tend to remain the same. And so while we might find ourselves not being carried off to the Neo-Babylonian Empire, we might arguably find ourselves in the midst of Babylon, like Daniel, and we have to decide where our identity will come from. Are we going to look for our identity as a citizen of an earthly kingdom, some earthly power, political party, a leader, or are we going to look for our identity in the King of Kingdoms, in the God who reigns and rules over all? Daniel chose to seek and find his identity in God, and we should do the same. And so it's good that we see the circumstances in Daniel's life are not all that different necessarily from things that people are still going through. So now, who is Daniel? Like I said, we don't know too much about him. We don't get much biographical information. We know his name. We know he's a real person. People reference him. Ezekiel will reference him. Jesus will make reference to him. And in fact, when Jesus references him over in Matthew chapter 24, he'll be quoting from the Septuagint, which is something that we'll talk about later. There are different manuscripts available in Hebrew and in Greek, and Jesus seems to prefer the Greek. So Ezekiel is going to be referring to Daniel. Jesus will refer to Daniel. We know he's a real person. We know, based off of the things that we see, the things that other people say, Daniel had a reputation for being wise, for being somebody that you could trust, somebody who was righteous, who sought justice, who did what they said they were going to do. They did the right thing. That's who Daniel was. As far as his station in Judean society, he was probably in the upper echelon. When you carried people off You brought either people who were politically connected, financially connected, socially connected, or just amazing at what they did. Now, him being young, 15, 20 years old, he's probably not well known as an artisan or a craftsman or a philosopher yet, but he might be socially connected, politically or financially connected. He's in the upper levels of Judean society somehow. And so he gets carried off with other people who are like him. And there'll be about 10,000 that are carried off. And you can see this, if you're interested, we can look real quick. You can see this over in 2 Kings chapter 24, just so you kind of know where this is coming from. 2 Kings chapter 24, we're going to look over in about verse 12 or so. And so here you've got these captives who are going to be carried off, and here are the 10,000 of them. He carried away all of Jerusalem and all the officials and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives and the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained except the poorest of the land, right? So the upper edge, right, the top of society is being carried off to Babylon, and we don't really know where Daniel fits in here. We don't know if he is maybe related to some of the soldiers. We just don't know. So we would have to guess, and we're just not going to. So he's carried off and brought to Babylon. Now, the religious setting, when we come back and we start thinking about the other things that are going on, the religious setting that Daniel is having to deal with is one of turmoil, right? We've already seen God is bringing judgment upon the people in Jerusalem. They are worshiping gods. They've been faithless to the covenant. The 12 have been reminding them, warning them. Jeremiah is warning them that Babylon is going to come and destroy the city, that the temple will be razed entirely and will be desolate for 70 years. You have all of these prophets warning that these things are going to happen, and Daniel is living in the middle of it. He's seeing the people not turn away from worshiping idols. He's seeing, we might call it syncretism, where there's all this blended worship that is happening, and he is seeing the results of that. And so when Daniel then is carried off into Babylon, as we'll see in chapter 1, he's going to have some choices to make. Is Daniel going to do the same things that the people in Jerusalem were doing? And if you think about it, if you live in Jerusalem and you've already kind of the culture has already given itself over into this syncretistic worship, where you're just blending different gods together, where you're merging politics and religion, and those things all just kind of run into one. When you get carried off into Babylon, it's not a difficult step to go from doing that in Jerusalem to doing that in Babylon. You just kind of change the God that's in the middle, right? You don't have to get rid of your God. You can still have your God when you get carried off into Babylon. You just change the one that your focus is on. Instead of being focused on Yahweh, you'll be focused on Marduk, or one of the other Babylonian gods, as we'll see just a few of them in a moment. And so Daniel is faced with this very, very powerful question. Who are you going to be when it's easy to be anything? Who are you going to be faithful to when no one is making you be faithful to anything? You get to pick. And that in that instance, we do find ourselves in a very similar situation in our culture today. Nobody's going to force you to worship God. Nobody's going to make you be faithful to the Lord. There are many different religious options. You can follow any variety of religions. We also live in a culture that tends to blend things together. We want to merge our religion and our politics. We want to merge our faith and our devotion to leaders and all sorts of things. Who are we going to be? Right? What path are we going to walk, and who are we going to join ourselves to? It's the same question Daniel is having to face himself. And in chapter 1, we see his choice. And that is going to lead him down this path, which will take us to the different events, the miracles that occur during his life, to different visions, to different revelations that the Lord will give him. And it's all going to start with this single choice: to whom will you be faithful? Who do you serve? Right? And so there's this echo of this question that Joshua would ask when he's about to cross the river over into the promised land. And he turns to the people and he says, choose this day whom you will serve. Or they're in the promised land and he's looking around. Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Here's Daniel making that choice, right? And it's a choice we have to make every day. Choose this day whom you will serve. Daniel will choose the Lord. So let's kind of get into some things about the book now, the book itself. And as we begin thinking about the book, there's a couple things that are interesting as you don't notice in English, and it's fine if you don't know any of the languages that it's written in. I don't know them, right? I don't know ancient Hebrew. I don't know Aramaic. But the book is written in two separate languages. It's written in the language of the Hebrew people, and part of it is written in the language of the Babylonian people. And so you've got this interesting break. The first roughly 7 chapters or so, from the beginning of chapter 2 to the very beginning of chapter 7, it's like 6 chapters or so, it's in Aramaic. Nobody knows why. Lots of people have guesses, and it's the historical part of the book that is in Aramaic. And so many people have supposed that perhaps the book is written in Aramaic because those parts would be important for the Babylonians to be able to read. For the people who the Hebrews found themselves among, it was important for them to be able to see the things that applied directly to themselves, to hear and understand and come to know. And so some people have supposed that it's in order to aid evangelism amongst the Babylonians, amongst the nations. God made it possible for them, or it was at least recorded so that everybody could read it. I think that's a good answer, but we don't know. It's just a guess, but it's a good guess. The second half of the book, from the beginning of chapter 7 down through the end, is again in Hebrew. And that tends to be the more forward-looking, looking at this kingdom that is coming. It's really focused on that. And so people are perhaps supposing that looking to the coming kingdom of the Messiah, it was really important that the Hebrew people could hear, read, and understand that. And so that's why the book is divided up the way that it is. But if you're reading it in English, you don't notice it, and it doesn't matter. It's just helpful to know that that division is there. So in the back of your mind, as you're reading through the text, you know at about chapter 7, there's this shifting gears. And so when we're reading it or trying to understand it, when we get to that place, we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit too, to maybe focus some more on what is coming in the future rather than on the current events that are going on during the life of Daniel and the people that you'll read about. So some other things about the style of the book. It is written in something that we call apocalyptic, right? It is an apocalyptic book. And when you hear the word apocalypse, right, it's most often associated with just terrible things. The zombie apocalypse is how you often hear it, or nuclear apocalypse. And it just doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean something that's destructive. I mean, I guess in English it can now, but the word itself, when you go back to the Greek, which is where we get it from, it doesn't mean, it has nothing to do with destruction. It has to do with an unveiling. Literally, it's an uncovering. It's taking the lid off something so you can see what's inside of it. The reason why Daniel writes in apocalyptic language is to show people things. And this is important because when we get to the book of Revelation, and it is also apocalyptic literature. In fact, the name of the book is not just Revelation, which, I mean, to reveal something is to show it. It is also called the Apocalypse of John, the revelation, the unveiling, the showing of John. And it is meant not to hide things from you. It is meant to show things to you, to unveil them, to maybe think, if you want to think about it, to kind of pull the curtain back so you can see what God is doing behind the events that you're seeing unfold in front of you, the current events and some events that may happen in the future. The purpose is to show you, look, there is this other world. There is a spiritual world that you can't see, but you are interacting with it on a daily basis, whether you realize it or not. And there is conflict in this world. There are angels, there are demons, there's God, there's Satan, there's all these things going on that you can't always see, but it's very real and it's very powerful and it affects your life. So the apocalyptic writing kind of takes the lid off of that. And you can see what is going on. You can see for yourself what is happening in this spiritual world, or the spiritual realm is maybe a better word. And you get to have a feel for what is going on behind the scenes. When we start talking about apocalyptic literature, there are some 10 different elements that you can identify both in Daniel and some of the other writings that are apocalyptic and in the Revelation that John will get later that we're going to be looking at in January. And it starts with this. It's from God. The visions that Daniel will receive in his book are from God. The visions that John will see in his revelation, they are from God. God is the source of the revelation. The second thing that you'll notice is there's a mediator. There's going to be angels in Daniel's book, and there is the Son of Man. There's Jesus in John's revelation, and they act as mediators for this revelation that is being shown to Daniel or John, depending on which book you're talking about. And then there's the seer. Daniel himself is the one who's going to be seeing these visions, and he's got to see something. And so these are some of the elements that we're noticing. God reveals things through a mediator to a seer in the form of visions, and those visions are going to be dealing with some current events. Daniel is going to be talking about the events in Babylon, and shortly thereafter with kingdoms that are coming. And so it's also going to be dealing with future events, not just events in the near future. And when I say near future, I mean a few hundred years out, right? Not just the near future, but even past that to the end, which we'll get to in just a minute. Now, these visions are going to be based upon themes. They're going to either establish or develop themes that you'll see throughout the text of Scripture. For example, animals are a very common theme throughout the text of Scripture. There's going to be rams, there's going to be serpents and dragons and grasshoppers and lions and all sorts of things that show up in various apocalyptic passages. Well, Daniel is going to have some animals in his visions too. John will have visions with animals. Peter will have visions with animals. And so there's this theme throughout the biblical text where people have visions and there are animals in it. When you begin to notice similarities in the visions and you begin to see what the animals represent, you can begin to understand, oh, okay, now I get what we're talking about because there is this theme. What you can't do with apocalyptic literature, you can't do it with Daniel and you can't do it with Revelation, is you can't go and try and make these visions actual things. For example, John is going to have a vision about a crazy grasshopper that has a female face and a lion's mane and a stinger, a scorpion stinger and iron teeth. It's just not a real thing. Right? It is combining different elements from different themes, different pictures in the biblical literature and pulling them into this one thing and saying, look, it's all of this stuff now. There's going to be beasts that arise, goats with horns and serpents and dragons. There isn't a beast that is going to rise with a bunch of horns. It's just a picture. And so when you get to Daniel's book and he tells you these pictures, that's all they are. They're images to teach you something, to show you something. And if all of a sudden they're talking about things that are actual, a real grasshopper that looks like that, it makes no sense at all. But if you take a step back and you go, okay, this is just a picture that means something, like we do with the movies that we make and the movies we watch today, the stories we tell, the pictures mean something. And so that's what we're seeing in this apocalyptic literature. These visions will come in the middle of tribulation. Here, we've talked about some of the chaos in Daniel's life. In the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, there's persecution arising from the Jews. There will be some sporadic persecution from the Romans that will gradually increase over time. And so there is tribulation amongst the people of God. And it is in the midst of that great upheaval, tribulation, that you get these apocalyptic images. And one of the things that they do is they're going to let you know that God is in charge. We'll get to that in just a minute. And so we've talked about some themes that might appear. There are also symbols that might show up, some numerology. Daniel is going to deal a lot with a time and times and half a time, or different numbers that are going to show up, 70 weeks, right? So there are going to be some significant numbers that show up in these different apocalyptic writings. And so when you get to a number, don't assume necessarily that it's a real number. When you get to Revelation and you have 144,000 who are going to be saved, don't assume that there's just 144,000 people, right? Because later in the book, there are myriads and myriads, an innumerable amount of people. So the numbers don't matter as actual numbers themselves, if that makes sense. They stand for something. The number 3 tends to be associated with God. The number 6 tends to be associated with imperfection. It's a day short of the full week. And so there's all of these different numbers and series of numbers that will show up. And we'll talk more about those when they actually show up in our text. The last thing, and this really is why I think you get apocalyptic literature in the middle of Great Tribulation, is because the message in apocalyptic literature is that God wins. Right, you're a young man, you're 15, you're 20 years old, you're going through your life, you've been ripped out of your home. You've seen people that you love ripped out of their homes, killed in conflict, killed in battle. You're being brought into a brand new country. You're being taught new languages, new culture, new everything. Wouldn't it be nice to know that there is something that is unshakable? There is something that will never fail, that will never falter, and that you are part of that. That you are part of this unshakable kingdom, that you are a servant of the God who will not be moved. Wouldn't that be comforting? And to Daniel and to the Hebrew people alive in his day, that was comforting. Their God is going to win. To Christians in the first century, to hear and to know that they were on the winning side, that is of great comfort. To us today, knowing that we haven't put our faith in stories, right, in myths, but we have put our faith in the prophetic word made sure. That is very comforting. In this year, 2020. I mean, just think of all the things that we have seen change. There's something that doesn't change, and that something is God. And so we too need the encouragement that we get from the apocalyptic writings. So one more thing before we move on to the actual text, the structure of the book itself, and this can kind of help us remember what's going on in the various chapters. The structure of the book accentuates deliverance, God delivering his people through various angels, right? So in the beginning in chapter 2, we're going to see kingdoms that are talked about with the statue that comes. In chapter 7, we're going to see some more kingdoms. Then in chapter 3 and chapter 6, there's tribulation that comes at the hand of the Gentiles. And in chapter 4 and chapter 5, there is deliverance. God delivers his people through angels, through these mediaries. And so you get kind of this chiastic structure that we saw in some of the other prophets, with the emphasis being on the deliverance that God gives to his people. Now, the interesting thing is, you get this, after you get introduced to Daniel in chapter 1, you get this structure. Then you're going to see the same structure show up with, again, chapter 7 being about kingdoms, and chapter 12 is ultimately going to be about God's kingdom, this unshakable, immovable kingdom that will cover the face of the earth. There's also tribulation, and there are angels who deliver. And so you get the book divided into these two sections that starts and ends with kingdoms. There's tribulation and God delivers. And so the message ultimately of Daniel, when you look at the structure of the book, is that God's people are going to find themselves in the midst of kingdoms throughout the earth. Those kingdoms are under the power of the evil one. The whole world, the Apostle John will say, the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. Satan is the ruler of this world, the Apostle Paul will say. However, in the middle of the tribulation, all the trouble that comes from the kingdoms of the world, the Lord will deliver his people. And ultimately, at the end, he delivers them into his very own kingdom, which is an everlasting kingdom, and it will never be shaken, and it will never be undone. That's where Daniel's going. And when we get to the chapter 12, that's what we're going to see. So that's what we have to look forward to over the next 4 weeks after this, as we're going through the different lessons. And so let's kind of dive into the text now and just look in chapter 1 of Daniel at names. My children often comment about how hard it must be for people from other countries who didn't grow up speaking English to learn English. And I can sympathize with that. Right? When I try to learn other languages, I love how set things are. There are rules, and almost all the time you follow the rules, things, verb endings. It's just great. In English, it's crazy. One of the reasons why English is crazy is because we have kind of had the language change over time. And the reason why we're talking about this is because words matter. Words matter. In 1066, the reason why English is so crazy is because in 1066, William the Conqueror comes over from Normandy and he fights in the Battle of Hastings and he wins. Well, he speaks French, and when he comes over to England, he wants to take over the way that people think. And so he forces people to speak French. The nobility will start speaking French, and now you wind up with 2, 3, 4 words for some of the same things. Have you ever wondered why we have both pork and swine? Well, that's because in 1066, you have this intermixing of all these languages. English was Germanic, and now French comes over. And so you have the mixture of all these different things going on. This is exactly what's happening to Daniel, right? He's being pulled out of Jerusalem, being thrown over into Babylon. And when he gets there, the very first thing they're going to do is try and change everything about how you talk, how you dress, what you eat, where you go. They're trying to change the gods that you worship. They are trying to brainwash you to make you into a Babylonian. William the Conqueror did that. When we see all throughout time, when one nation goes and conquers another one, and however they try and make it sound PC, winning the hearts and minds of the people, whatever they say, basically what they mean is we're trying to make them more like us, because people who are more like us won't fight. And so when these Hebrews are brought to Babylon, they're trying to change them into Babylonians. They're going to try and change what they eat, how they talk, and even who they are. And so the names of these Hebrew men in this first chapter become very significant. And it's interesting that you get introduced to them as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah at the beginning of chapter 1. And then at the end of chapter 1, they are still Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Still, right? They didn't change. And so the fact that their names, they're given new names, but they keep their old ones, is symbolic of the fact that they're going to keep their identity. So when we think about the history of all these different things, and helping to explain our own crazy language, right? That's why things are the way that they are, because people try and make changes. So when you get into the text in chapter 1, let's pull up our Bibles, if you got them, over in Daniel chapter 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. This is 605. Jehoiakim will start reigning in 608, 609, about 608. 3 years later, here comes Nebuchadnezzar, and he carries people off. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them, Nebuchadnezzar, brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his god, Marduk, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his god. And so what these vessels become is a symbol carrying off the pieces of furniture or various cups or basins or censers, all the different things that the Israelites, that the people in Judah would use in the temple of Jerusalem. They're now carried off and they're put in Marduk's temple. And they're trophies. Look, Marduk beat your god. Marduk is stronger than your god. Marduk has your god's things. Now, while they are trophies, they are still important, right? The Babylonians would have recognized that these are still sacred items. We're not going to take them and abuse them. That becomes important later. But they are emblems of their god's victory over a weaker or a lesser god. This is really important, because in these ancient cultures, what you did is when you spoiled a people, you took their holy things and you brought them in and you set them before your god, and they became emblems of glory, right? They display the magnificence and the glory and the might of your God, because your God defeated this other one. Now, pause Daniel for just a second, and let's go over to Ephesians chapter 2. I promise, well, I hope this will make sense. Let's go over to Ephesians chapter 2. This is so cool. So in Ephesians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul is writing, and the Apostle Paul says, you were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you once walked, right? So you're dead to God. You are walking in a certain way. You are following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the ruler of this world, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and we were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. So basically what he's saying is you were part of this other kingdom. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. So, verse 7, in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace in kindness towards us in Christ Jesus. What you have just read, if you've been reading along, is God spoils the kingdom of darkness. and he steals the valuables, you and me. He carries us back to his own temple. Right? He raised us up with him. Look at verse 6. He raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. That's the Lord in his holy temple, right? He has brought us into his dwelling place, and he has seated us before him. And now we are the trophies seated before God, showing how magnanimous, how glorious, how great God is for all eternity, as the immeasurable riches of his grace are shown through us in Christ Jesus. So God has raided Satan and stolen you back, and he now puts you in his temple, and you show his glory for eternity. This, you can see this in other places. Look over in Colossians chapter 1, just this idea of kingdoms. And this is why it's so important that in Daniel we see that what we're dealing with is the king of all kingdoms. God has sacked all of them. He has raided all of them. He has carried off all the valuables from all the kingdoms, right? Here he has delivered us from the domain of darkness, and he has transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. You've been moved. God went and he raided Satan's kingdom. He took you out, and now you are a trophy, right? The glory of God is shown in you in Christ Jesus. That is so amazing. And we can see that, right? This is a theme that is again and again throughout the text of scriptures. And here we see just the beginning of Daniel chapter 1. That's what they did, right? They stole things that were valuable, and they came and they put them in the house of their own God. And so God is actually judging Judah. It is not that Marduk is stronger than him. It's not that the Babylonians are so great, but God is judging his people for their sins. And so even in judgment, what you're seeing is that God is superior. God is the one who directs the Babylonians, not Marduk. God is the one who will redeem the people of Judah later, not Marduk. And so the Babylonian gods are nothing. God is everything. Whether God is coming in judgment or God is coming in deliverance, God is everything. And that is important, that we see that here, this conflict at the beginning, where the Babylonians are trying to overpower God, so to speak, to show how their own gods are better and superior and bigger and greater. And we are shown that no, that's actually not the case. And we're going to see that in chapter 1. So what we've got is God coming in judgment on Judah. And we're going to see that God is superior. How is God superior? Well, a variety of ways. So as we think about our text again, God being superior, we're going to look at the first couple of verses 3 through 5, and we're going to look at how God is superior in value, at least as far as Daniel is concerned. So in verse 3, the king is going to command Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both the royal family and the nobility, youths without blemish. So that's why we think he's young, 15, 20 years old. Without blemish, of good appearance, skillful, with all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to understand the king's palace, to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them all about the Babylonian way of life, right? To teach them the language of the Chaldeans. And they're going to get a portion of daily food that the king will eat, and the wine that the king will drink. And they're to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. So this is what's going on. And we talked earlier about how you brainwash people. When you conquer them, you want them to become like you, so that they will put their value in the things that you put value in. That they will actually find their identity in you. You want these Hebrews to stop being Hebrews and to start being Babylonians. Right? That's what they want. They want them to assimilate into their culture. They want them to forget who they were and become Babylonians. This is why, in chapter 1, and the book, really, language, customs, food are so important, because that's who these young men were. They ate what they ate because they were servants of God. They dressed the way that they dressed because they were servants of God. They styled their beard, they styled their hair, all according to the Torah, to the way that God told them to dress and fix themselves and eat. And when they come into Babylon, they have to choose which identity are they going to follow. At least as much as they're able to choose. You don't always get to choose in the ancient world. And so these young men who are coming, again, we don't know exactly how old they are, 15, 20 years old as a guess. When Ezekiel is carried off, Ezekiel is probably 25 or 30, and he's not chosen to be in the house of the king. So you're dealing with younger people because they're more impressionable. And there's a couple lessons here. First, we should be teaching young people. We should be training them and showing them who they ought to be. And second, We need to be guarding them because they are impressionable, and it's very easy for the world to leave its mark instead of God. And that's the battle you're seeing. Who gets the hearts and minds of Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael? Who will they serve? Who will they follow? By whom will they be named? Will they be called? So then we've got these values, right? God is superior in these values, in these different things that we've seen. Now let's look at greatness. Verses 6 through 7. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them these names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he calls Shadrach, Mishael he calls Meshach, and Azariah he calls Abednego. Here's their names: Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Interestingly enough, those Babylonian names tend to be the ones by which they are called. Instead of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, we call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The text calls them both, so don't beat yourself up if you tend to call them by their Babylonian names. We just have to realize that the names are significant here. So Daniel, when you start looking at what do these names mean, Daniel means the Lord is gracious, right? Or God, Hananiah means the Lord is gracious. Daniel means the Lord is my judge. The Lord has helped me. Mishael means who is like God? Who is there that is like God? Azariah means the Lord has helped. Shadrach means instead of Hananiah, Hananiah becomes Shadrach. Instead of the Lord is gracious, now we have the command of Aku, who is a moon goddess. Right? Instead of grace, now you have command and might and power. The Babylonians really love their moon gods. Mishael becomes Meshach. And Meshach is who is there like Aku. Instead of who is there who is like God, who is there who is like Aku. Do you see why the names matter? Because they have taken the Lord is gracious and turned it into our God is stronger. They've taken who is there like the Lord and turned that into who is there like Aku, who is there like our God. Then you have Azariah, who is changed to Abednego. And Azariah means the Lord has helped. And instead now this means servant of Nebo. Instead of the Lord helping, now it's you serve our God. Daniel, God is my judge. God keeps me. Belteshazzar, protect the life of the king. So they've replaced God with the king of Babylon. And so those name switches, they're important. They changed their names on purpose, right? It wasn't just, oh, Belteshazzar, that sounds cool. We'll call him that. It was, we want you, instead of worshiping your God, to worship our king. We want you, instead of looking for God's grace, we want you to listen to the commandments of our God. We want you, instead of realizing that your God is great, to realize that our God is great. And so these switches are significant. And it's the same switch that Satan has been trying to pull on the people of God since the beginning of time. Worship me, not your God. Right? That's one of the temptations for Christ. If you bow down and worship me, I'll give you everything. Right? He wants to switch God. Give in to following the ways of the world. Right? I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. Right? So these are the same temptations that have worked on humans throughout time, being presented to us in these name changes. And at the end of the chapter, we're going to see they don't change their names. Right? Now, the people in Babylon are going to call them whatever their Babylonian name is. But as far as Daniel, Azariah, Mishael, and Hananiah are concerned, their names stay the same. They keep their identity in God because God is the one who is great. So the next thing we're going to see is their daily life. When we get back over to our text and we start looking in chapter 8, or verse 8, sorry, you've got the king's food. And food is interesting throughout the biblical text. There are always people who are worried about food, what you eat, when you eat, why you eat, because God tells them there are only certain things you can eat and it has to be prepared certain ways. So when Daniel says in verse 8, he resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or the wine that he drank, there's probably a couple reasons why. Wherever you lived, wine is pretty much wine, and we don't know what the king was eating. But it probably wasn't prepared according to the kosher dietary laws. That's one thing. Probably wasn't prepared the way that the Hebrew people had to prepare their food. The other thing, and perhaps the more important thing, is that this food and this wine would have been commemorated or dedicated or from a religious festival or worship to the Babylonian gods, Marduk, Nebo, Aku. And so instead of eating the food that was dedicated to these gods, Daniel said, I'm just going to eat vegetables. I'm just going to eat what I know is safe. It's prepared safe, right? I can eat the vegetables raw. And I know that these haven't been dedicated to those gods because it's not what they did. And so Daniel, rather than defiling himself with the king's food, which I'm sure was delicious. If you had the King James Version, it talks about the king's dainties, right? Because it was probably really good. I just love that, the king's dainties. And so here Daniel is saying, well, I'm not doing that. And his friends, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, are also going to say, well, we're not doing that either. They have chosen to follow the Lord. They have chosen not to dedicate themselves to Babylon, to not become Babylonian, to not worship the false gods, but to stay faithful to the true God. And there's this really neat story of the test where they're going to go and talk to the chief eunuch, and he's going to say, well, I'll die right here. If I don't listen to what the king says and you're not healthy, then I'll die. And here's something really cool. As far as we know, there is nothing in the king's food that isn't healthy. It's not like they were only eating fried chicken and donuts, right? We don't know what it is that the king's food was eating, but it's what he fed his closest people, his advisors, his wise men. They were given this good food. Chances are it was really good and it was really healthy. It was just dedicated to gods and maybe not prepared the right way. It should have made Daniel healthy. It should have made the other people healthy. And what this ought to do, when we see Daniel saying, no, just vegetables, just water, what this ought to do is this ought to open our eyes to just how involved we are with this spiritual world that we can't see all the time. Have you ever thought about what you're doing when you're eating? That you are taking into your body pieces of the creation. You are powering this body that God has formed and designed. You are powering it with pieces of the creation. So God has made things, and you can't control it. You can't make corn grow. It just does. And you eat it. You are being powered by the things that God has put in place, that God has created, that God has provided. You are entirely dependent upon your health to God. And here God just chooses. Right? There's no textual reason why the king's food should not have made the people who ate it healthier, other than we see God choosing. Right? Let our appearance be observed and deal with us according to what you see. Daniel wasn't saying, oh, I know that my food is healthier. Daniel is saying that I know that my God will provide. And so he is trusting. He is keeping himself holy. He is setting himself apart to the service of God, trusting that God is going to work out the details. God is going to make things work out so that I can serve him faithfully wherever I am, whoever I am, wherever I am living. And God does that. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. I don't know about you, but have you ever dieted for 10 days? How much weight did you lose? It doesn't work like that, right? If it does, let me know your diet, right? That's just not how it works. And so what you see is God here interceding on behalf of his people and causing them to be healthier. We sometimes lose sight of how involved God is in our life, of how active the spiritual realms are, and how important it is to be completely and totally and absolutely dependent upon God in everything. The minute we decide that we're going to do things our way, we're living in Babylon, right? Or we have become Babylonian. Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, they're in Babylon, but they're not Babylonian. And this is the difficulty that we as the Lord's people see ourselves in today. I love the country that we live in. But when you step back and take a look at it, it's Babylon. Right? Not because it's terrible or awful or wicked or anything like that. It's just a kingdom of the world. That's what they all are. They're all, in a sense, Babylon. And we find ourselves, the Lord's people, dwelling in the midst of them, and we have to choose who we're going to be. We have to choose after who we're going to walk. Who are we going to name ourselves after? In whom are we going to find our identity? And when we get here to the end, what we're going to see is that God rewards his faithful people. Right? They have chosen to follow him. They've put their trust in him. They're looking to him to lead them, to guide them, and God is going to reward them. And we see that in verse 17, that the Lord rewards them. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill and literature and wisdom, and Daniel had all understanding and visions and dreams. That's going to be important later. At the end of time, when the king had commanded they should be brought in, they bring them before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king speaks with them. And among everybody, there is no one found like Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, except they're Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Not those Babylonian names. And so what you see is these people come in, and they stand before the king, victorious through their faith. They went through the Babylonian ringer, and they came out Hebrew. Right? They went into Babylon faithful to the Lord. And no matter what anybody else did, no matter how many of the other people left and became just like the Babylonians, these 4, they stayed faithful. Why 4? We can talk about that number later. We're going to have lots of time to talk about numbers. But Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah were faithful to the Lord. They go into Babylon and they stay. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And there they stand before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in the kingdom. And Daniel was there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. We'll talk more about that timeline later, but here they are, the Lord's faithful people standing before the king. And the message here is that, yes, we need to be faithful before the earthly kingdoms and before the earthly kings. But the message here, when you kind of step back and look at where we're going with Daniel, is that there is a kingdom coming that is unshakable, that will cover the face of the earth, that will last forever. And one day you get to stand before the king. You're in Babylon now. Don't change your name. Don't become like everybody else. Because who you are matters. Who you name yourself after matters. And we will be given a new name. You've been given a new name if you are a servant of the Most High King, the Lord Jesus Christ. Don't change your name. Remain faithful to the Lord, and one day we will stand before the King. And so that's where we're going. Right? That's ultimately where we're going to wind up in chapter 12 at the end of the book of Daniel. This kingdom is coming. You can't stop it. It's going to cover the face of the earth. And all the faithful will enter in, and we will shine as bright as the stars, redeemed, brought into the Lord's holy temple, trophies of his glorious grace, proclaiming to the universe for all eternity how matchless and wonderful and incredible is our God. God bless you. We'll be back next week, and we'll continue looking at the book of Daniel.